Hi everyone, thanks for dialing in to this presentation. I'm Kate Wilson, I'm Research Director and Deputy GM across both Australia and New Zealand. And I'm going to be taking you through some of our latest research into SMEs in New Zealand. This research is literally just out of field. Survey we do twice a year, talking to 500 SMEs in New Zealand. And really what I wanted to talk about today is the changes that we're seeing in the market through the pandemic, but in particular, through what I've called the pandemic recovery. So as we start to come out the other side of this, how are SMEs thinking and feeling? What additional support do they need? How is that different to what we would have seen a couple of years ago? And then also importantly, how has the world changed for SMEs? So what are the things that they really are thinking about and really need support with? So what I will start off with is just a bit of an overview in terms of what we're seeing around business sentiment at the moment, how SMEs are feeling in particular about the short term of their business over the next 12 months. What are the key challenges that they're facing? And then I'll start to look at how that is different compared to what we saw pre-pandemic, how their needs have changed, and then importantly, what are the opportunities that exist in terms of supporting SMEs through this year, further into the future. Where are the areas where SMEs are really looking for that support, and where does that give financial services providers perhaps an opportunity to stand out in terms of meeting the needs or the changing needs of SMEs? What I want to start off with is a bit of an overview around what we're seeing in terms of business sentiment. So business sentiment is something we've been tracking in New Zealand for a couple of years now. We look at this both in terms of short-term and longer-term business sentiment, but for the sake of this presentation, I'll really be focused on what we're seeing in terms of short-term sentiment. So what we're looking at here is the extent to which SMEs are not confident about the future of their business over the next 12 months. So you can really see in May 2020, the extent to which we saw the pandemic really impacting quite significantly on business sentiment. Historically, business sentiment has sat at around 10%, maybe a little bit lower. That basically doubled or more than doubled when we went into the pandemic. So in May 2020, we saw it jump up to 1 in 5. You could probably argue here as well that there's still a little bit of a higher rate of SMEs saying they're not confident about the next 12 months. And we see that as well when we start to look at the percentage who are confident. So similarly, in May 2020, we saw quite a significant dip in terms of proportion of businesses confident about the future of their business over the next 12 months. That came back up. So we started to see a return to more positive business sentiment through the back end of 2020 and into 2021. But we're still a little bit lower than what we've seen historically. So both the proportion of SMEs who are highly confident is lower than it was pre-pandemic, and similarly, proportion who are not at all confident, higher than it was pre-pandemic. So I think what that probably tells us is while we are maybe thinking about post-pandemic and thinking about recovery, there is still lower sentiment or lower confidence than what we've seen historically in the market. So in terms of thinking about how to support SMEs, just being aware of the fact that SMEs are still a little bit uncertain or a little bit more uncertain compared to they would have been pre-pandemic. And I'll go into in a little bit more detail what we're seeing around the types of concerns that SMEs have. But firstly, what are we seeing just in terms of concern around just the pandemic in general? This question we started looking at in 2020, trying to understand the key challenges, the key issues that businesses are facing. This is a verbatim question, so we allow SMEs to give us a range of different types of challenges. And this, I think, is quite a telling question in terms of how SMEs are thinking and what they really need support with. What we're looking at here is the extent to which SMEs are saying something explicitly referring to the pandemic. So anytime COVID-19, coronavirus was mentioned, that's what we're looking at here. So if you can imagine back in May 2020, and probably if we looked at this in the end of March or into April, we would have seen an even higher proportion here. But in May 2020, the pandemic or the coronavirus was really the number one thing that SMEs were concerned about. Almost 40% of SMEs making some reference to the pandemic in terms of the number one challenge that their business is facing. That has dropped off, so it's dropped down to 20%. But we're still seeing that means 1 in 5 SMEs whose number one challenge or problem is the direct impacts of the pandemic. And we'll dig into what's sort of coming out here in terms of why they're referring to COVID-19. It does implicitly relate to those more direct impacts. So having to go into lockdown was a key one that we really saw coming through, having to close my store, having less customers, those really direct impacts of what we're seeing here. As I said, has come down, but there's still quite a high degree of sentiment around this. And if we start to expand this out and look at what else SMEs are worried about, what the other challenges that they're facing, there's what I would probably term pandemic adjacent concerns coming through here. So they're not necessarily specifically related to COVID-19 or the pandemic, but I think they're indirectly related to the pandemic and more so the longer term challenges that are going to arise. So if we put aside that 20% of SMEs who said the pandemic in general and lockdowns, the pandemic specifically, and things like lockdowns and vaccinations. What else is it that SMEs are really concerned about? Things like the economy. So the fact that the economy has taken a hit, loss of customers is another key one that really comes through. The other one I think that's an important one, especially in the New Zealand market, we see this in Australia a little bit, but probably not to the same extent. But the skills shortage. So having a skills shortage, having a shortage of labour, the fact that borders are still closed, so not having that migration coming in, and technology, which I'm going to come back to as we go on. But the fact that the world has really changed, the resources that were available to SMEs in the past aren't there to the same extent. And at the same time, they're having to change and adapt and pivot. So we're living in quite a different world. SMEs are very aware of that and are looking for that support, for that help around these types of things. These are the number one things that they're really worried about and concerned about at the moment. If we start to think about how SMEs are adapting to the new normal, what they're trying to do, and what are the things that SMEs are looking at in terms of that post-pandemic, that recovery piece, we are starting to see again some positive signs here in terms of what SMEs are looking to do in the next 12 months. So as I said before, we have seen confidence increase, perhaps not quite back to pre-pandemic levels. We are seeing increased confidence in the market. We are also starting to see an increase in SMEs who are looking to do things that I would say are related to growth. So in particular, we're seeing quite significant increases in SMEs saying that they're looking to develop new products and services. Going back to that challenge around skill shortage, we're seeing SMEs increasingly saying they want to recruit new employees. And then there's also a range of sort of other things SMEs are trying to do in relation to technology. So adding sales channels, investing in emerging technology, investing in equipment and machinery. So looking at a more growth focused mindset. This is what I would probably expect to change as we go through the next 12 months, assuming that SMEs continue to become more confident. If we look at an SME who is more confident about the future, they are typically more likely to be intending to do all of these things, and in particular that developing new products and services. So again, the confidence really connected to ideas around growth. SMEs are starting to think, what do I need to do over the next 12 months? How do I need to adapt my business? Where I think that creates an opportunity for financial services providers is around supporting SMEs with those needs. What we can sort of consistently see in our data is the fact that SMEs have a bit of a pain point around the extent to which they believe that their primary business bank is committed to their long-term growth. So if you haven't been in an RFi presentation before, or if you have been in an RFi presentation before, you'll be very familiar with these slides. If you haven't, I'll just talk you through how to read this one. But what we're looking at here is the extent to which SMEs agree or are satisfied with each of these statements on the right. We've plotted that along the vertical axis, so looking at average satisfaction with each of those attributes. And then along the horizontal, we've correlated that with overall satisfaction. So the idea here being anything on the far right-hand side of this chart is something that's important for SMEs. It's important to them in terms of driving the overall satisfaction. They're important elements to be considering and investing in and making sure they're right. Anything on the left-hand side, less connected to driving satisfaction. Doesn't mean these things aren't important for other reasons. And for example, online and mobile banking capabilities, you can see they aren't as highly correlated with satisfaction, but they are very important in terms of driving acquisition, so driving drivers of choice. But if we're just focused on satisfaction, what are the pain points for SMEs? And I think you probably argue that all of these things we could maybe term pain points, given that we're not seeing anything above an 8 out of 10 in terms of average satisfaction. But looking at sort of those key points, what are the things that are most important to driving satisfaction, and where are SMEs less satisfied at the moment? Number one is around range of products to meet the business's needs. I won't spend too much time in this presentation talking about access to lending. I think there's other parts of the agenda today that really go into that in more detail. But it is one of the things that we are seeing at the moment as SMEs are looking to grow and adapt and to recover, that access to finance does, of course, become more important. This also, I think, just talks to the range of business banking products actually meeting the business's needs in terms of being sort of more flexible, more adaptive to the SME's specific needs, rather than just having a lot of different products. The one I really want to focus on here, though, is number 15, which is, again, highly correlated with satisfaction in an area where SMEs are less satisfied compared to these other elements. And that's commitment to the business's long-term growth. So if we're thinking about the fact that SMEs are starting to become more confident about their future, they're starting to look at diversifying and looking at growth, but they don't necessarily see their primary business bank as being able to demonstrate commitment on that front. So they're thinking about their primary business bank as not necessarily believing in or helping them to achieve that longer term growth. So that's something I think financial services providers should really be considering. How can you make sure that SMEs, that your current SME customers, feel like you are there for them, feel like you're providing them with the tools and the services that they need to grow? And then likewise, from an acquisition standpoint, how can you demonstrate that to the market in order to bring business customers in? The other thing that's changed quite a bit over the last 12 months, last 18 months, is how SMEs are interacting with their providers. So I think channel strategy, the importance of digital has also changed quite a lot. We know that, of course, over the last 18 months, we've seen really significant shifts around how SMEs and consumers are interacting with their banks. That rise of digital has really accelerated through the pandemic. And in New Zealand, we already do see quite a high rate of digital adoption, both for consumer and business. So I think digital's always been there in terms of an important element, but we can expect that we're living in a new digital world. This is going to be more important going forward as well. The other thing that I just wanted to point out is that this is something that isn't just important in terms of how SMEs are interacting with their providers, but it's also something that SMEs are increasingly asking for. So this is looking at what SMEs are asking for in terms of help managing the pandemic. And increasingly over the last 12 months, we've seen SMEs saying, make it easier for me to complete tasks without visiting a branch. You could probably argue that as we come out of the pandemic, this sort of channel related element, it becomes more important compared to just that sort of initial support or more direct support. So now that I feel like I'm more in control and I don't need that direct support, or I don't need things like reduction in fees, I'm starting to think more about what do I want longer term. But making it easy for me to complete tasks without visiting a branch, and make it easy for me to do things without going in and talking to a real person, using digital services. And to a lesser extent, also what we're seeing there is 1 in 4 SMEs saying, provide more support with using online or digital, online or mobile banking services for the first time. So not just making it easier for me to do this digitally, but also support me in starting to do these things digitally. We're also increasingly seeing digital become a key driver of primary business bank switching. There's 2 key points to point out here. One is that despite the fact that SMEs are pretty happy with the way their business bank has supported them through the pandemic, they're pretty happy with their business bank in general. We haven't necessarily seen satisfaction changing too significantly over time, but we have seen switching intent going up. So the proportion of SMEs who are highly likely to switch their primary business bank in the next 12 months has gone up pretty consistently over the last couple of years. And if we look at the right-hand side of this slide, we're actually seeing better pricing and fees decline as a driver of switching, which is an interesting one. Generally what we'd see and what we would probably always expect to see with a question like this is pricing and fees is a key driver of switching. So belief that I'm going to get better prices elsewhere, or just a belief that I'm not getting a competitive price where I am at the moment, both a push and a pull factor in terms of switching. But it has dropped off a little bit, which means there's something else happening in the market, which is driving up that increase in switching intent. Going back to what I mentioned before on that pain point around business growth, potentially there's something there just around SMEs not feeling like they're getting the support that they need. But if we're looking at these key drivers of business bank switching, key push factors, Better online and mobile banking has also increased over time, is now the second most important driver of switching. So in addition to SMEs saying, I want you to make it easier for me to do these things online, SMEs are also saying to a greater extent that they were in the past, I'm going to switch because I think I can get a better digital banking service elsewhere. Digital, as I said before, not as core to driving satisfaction, but as we can see here, very important in terms of both the retention piece, but also I think in terms of acquisition, and the digital also becoming more hygiene over time. So something that SMEs are expecting, but also, as you can see here, potentially differentiating on when they're looking at different providers as well. The other final point I wanted to make are just around how SME needs are changing. So we've seen going through those previous slides, SMEs are still facing key challenges in terms of coming out the other side of the pandemic, key challenges related to recovery, and are looking for support in and longer term in terms of business growth as well. They're looking for really good digital. They're choosing to switch based on digital to a greater extent, as well as asking for the ability to do more things via digital services, digital banking services. The other thing that we're really seeing changing through the pandemic is the extent to which customers are going online. So that shift to digital that I mentioned before isn't just happening for banking, of course, consumers shopping online to a greater extent. Also, I think expecting businesses to be online where they need them, when they need them. So that pivot to online isn't something that just needs to be taken into consideration in terms of how you service SMEs, but also potentially in supporting SMEs to service their own customers online. So I'll talk through just a few slides here around what we're seeing both on the consumer side of things and on the merchant side of things as well. So looking more specifically at a merchant SME here. First key change that we've seen is around just payment behaviour more broadly, and I'll talk about where e-commerce fits into this in just a moment. But if we just look at how consumer payment behaviour has been changing over time, there's a couple of key things that we're seeing change. One is the light blue line here, which is debit card usage or scheme debit card usage, which has been going up very consistently over time as more customers have access to debit cards as well. The other thing that's really driving up that increase in scheme debit card usage is contactless. We saw really significant shifts in our data in terms of contactless card usage over the last, or actually just between the 6 months between May 2020 and November 2020. We saw the rate at which consumers were using contactless cards, so frequency of usage, but also just a proportion of consumers who'd ever used a contactless cards really jumping quite significantly. And those numbers have held as well. So consumers are continuing to use contactless cards at a more frequently than they were pre-pandemic. So that customer behavior is really here to stay, and something that merchants again need to be thinking about in terms of an in-store piece. But the other thing that we're seeing changing, and again, arguably a longer term change, is declining cash usage. So consumers shifting away from cash. We saw a really significant drop in cash usage in our May 2020 data. So as we went into the pandemic, cash usage dropping off really significantly. And you can see hasn't really recovered either. So cash usage continues to be down. Some of that is customers going from using cash to using something like contactless cards because of greater acceptance, perception around hygiene of using contactless, and some of that messaging that we saw back in the pandemic, in the middle of the pandemic. Some of it will also be because of the shift to e-commerce. So doing more things online, obviously not being able to pay for online purchases with cash. So some of that is a change in customer behavior in terms of where they're shopping as well. I think importantly, we also saw that same data point being reflected in our merchant research. So when we looked at what merchants were reporting in terms of where their customers were paying or how their customers were paying, we similarly saw a shift to both debit and credit, away from FPOS, away from cash, and also a shift towards PayPal. And some of that will again be a reflection of the fact that customers were going online to a greater extent, so helping to boost up things like PayPal because more of these sales were online. But also again, that shift away from cash and towards those scheme debit cards and other sort of more and other payment methods. If we look more specifically at e-commerce, we've seen the proportion of consumers who make purchases online regularly or relatively frequently. that has been increasing over time, and is very high when we look at that. I was going to say younger customer group, but actually if you go all the way up to a 55-year-old, so 55 and under, we're seeing the majority of consumers now saying that they use, that they make purchases online at least once a week, lower amongst that 55 plus age group. But it is still increasing at perhaps a bit of a slower rate. But if we're looking at that under 55 group, over 60% now saying that they make purchases online in a typical month. This is just domestic. We also do capture international, but just to focus on domestic here. Again, we can expect that this trend will continue. This trend predates the pandemic, but the pandemic definitely helped to accelerate this shift towards e-commerce. And similarly, when we start to look at that from a merchant perspective, we're seeing a significantly high proportion of merchants say that they accept card payments online. The majority of merchants who do accept card payments online think it's going to be a bigger focus for them over the next 12 months. And if you look at SMEs who don't currently accept card payments online, we're seeing quite a high proportion intending to begin accepting card payments online in the next 12 months. So a pivot towards an online store. And a lot of this is really being driven by the idea of customer demand. Customers are online, customers want to pay online, customers want to shop online. So I need to be there as a merchant in order to capture those customers, to retain the customers that I already have, but also in terms of bringing in new customers. So again, a bit of a step change in terms of how customers or consumers are behaving, but also that impact on SMEs and on merchants. The other point I just wanted to end with here, just around that shift towards e-commerce. So we're seeing SMEs increasingly moving towards e-commerce. We're seeing those who aren't online wanting to go online. There is a perception amongst SMEs who don't, or merchants who don't accept card payments online, that starting up an online store would be difficult, would be time consuming, both in terms of the setup of the online store, but also in terms of the setup of the card acceptance facilities. That is one of the key barriers that is stopping an SME who wants to start accepting card payments online from actually making that step. It's too difficult, it's too time consuming. I would just need help with this, or I need someone to help me with this. When you go through to those who have already made this change, to those who have got an e-commerce facility, generally they found the process of setting it up pretty easy, but also a lot of them, when we asked them why they considered it to be easy, said that they got some form of help. So I had an expert helping me, I had an advisor, I talked to someone who gave me what I needed, there was someone available to talk me through it. So that's the experience that merchants are having when they actually do go through that process. But I think, again, going back to the point around supporting SMEs, supporting their longer term growth, I think we can expect, or we really know that there's going to be a greater focus on e-commerce, there's going to be a greater focus on online stores. Being able to position yourself or financial services providers more broadly as being able to help SMEs and merchants go online, set up e-commerce facilities, to go through that pivot, that I think positions you well in terms of helping them with that longer term growth piece. Couple of final points here, a couple of key takeaways to leave you with. We are seeing confidence return for SMEs. We're not out of the woods just yet. There is still lower confidence than we've seen pre-pandemic. The other point here is that the direct impacts of the pandemic in terms of things like lockdowns are still a concern for SMEs, but also a lot of the other concerns that SMEs have at the moment are what I would call pandemic adjacent. So they're things like, how am I going to pivot? How am I going to go to a more online world? How am I going to find the staff that I need? How am I going to deal with a lack of customers or less a less favorable economy? So maybe not as much need as what we would have seen in the past around directly talking to SMEs about the impacts of the pandemic and giving them that direct support, but SMEs still do need support and guidance around those other areas. And I think more varied areas as well. So in some ways harder to deal with and harder to manage in terms of the varied types of support and varied concerns that SMEs have at the moment. A positive, I think, is that SMEs are looking to grow and to diversify. I think that's something we can expect to become more prevalent in the market as business confidence increases. We're seeing that in other markets as well. In a market like Australia, going through sort of a similar point in time, being more post-pandemic than what we're seeing in other markets. Again, we see that coming through. SMEs are looking to grow. They are looking for funding for that. But I think more broadly, there is a need to position financial services providers as able to help SMEs to achieve growth. That's a key pain point that exists for SMEs at the moment. And then finally, I think there is a need to support SMEs when it comes to digital. So there's 2 points to this. One is making sure that SMEs have access to good digital business banking services, something that SMEs are asking for, something that is increasingly driving switching. But the other point here, I think, and maybe thinking more on the merchant side of things here, but helping SMEs to pivot to a more digital world. So helping them to set up an online store, helping them to create a website, helping them to accept card payments online, all of those elements becoming more important in the current environment. And again, I think goes back to that idea of helping SMEs grow, helping SMEs to survive and thrive in this new post-pandemic world. Thank you so much for your time today. If you've got any questions, hopefully you've put them in the chat, but otherwise do feel free to reach out to me directly as well. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.